I guess the first question is, how do comics work?
Well, it's funny you should ask me that, Tim, because I've got this book out that I wrote with a good friend of mine, and really, rather than I could read the book out.
Yes, yeah, just read it all the way through.
Well, how comics work? Well, I mean, it's the thing that I always wondered from a very early age, and I sort of had to find out for myself. And you know, there were obvious things that I didn't know, like, for instance, that comic book pages were always drawn much bigger than they appeared in print, which is probably why I wear glasses and have a persistent headache, because it's much easier to draw them bigger. And over the many years I've been working in it, I think I've kind of got a handle on how comics work. And as I didn't go to art school, I've really learned everything I know either through talking to people or through reading books about how to draw comics the Marvel way or whatever. And I always had the idea that I would like to do a book, you know, to impart what I've learned. And when Tim proposed to me that, you know, we do this book, it was the perfect chance, because basically I didn't have to do any typing. And I just had to talk, and that's something that always comes very easy to me. And Tim's done a wonderful job of distilling down all my rambling stream of consciousness stuff, and the guys at Rotavision have put together a really nice design. So now, if you want to know how comics work, you just have to buy this book.
So that comes quite an interesting point, because I think when we were doing this project, we both had that love of books that teach you how to do comics or how to do art, and yeah. we have that, you know, this as we said, you know, this is the kind of book that we would love to get ourselves.
Yes.
If we hadn't done it. You know?
Yeah. Oh, sure.
But you know, when you were growing up, were there any books out there like this that actually kind of helped you?
No, there would be books about kind of cartooning, but then cartooning is a sort of different thing. Or there were the Walter T. Foster books, which were big, oversized, sort of treasury edition size books. But again, they would only give you tantalisingly brief information. Or they do that thing that drawing books do, where it starts off with 2 circles, and then the next thing it's a picture of a gorgeous woman. And you think, well, how did you do that? You know, so it was quite hard to find things out. But what you're saying about process, I think people love to see process. I know I do. And of course you only have to look at something like the Great British Bake Off. See, people love to see how it all comes about. And personally, when it comes to original art, I'm always less interested in people's finished artwork than I am in the preparatory stages, because in the preparatory stages you can see them thinking. It's like they're thinking drawing. The finished thing is sort of clean and perfect, and just as you see it in print. So this book has got a lot of that behind the scenes stuff, and it has got lots of stuff that was never intended to be seen, and probably if I'd had my way I wouldn't have let you see it, because I want it to be my best drawings and the really pretty drawings. But Tim was quite good at saying, no, we want this one and that one, because they might not be the most perfect drawing, but they are the one that shows the process the most clearly. So that really was the focus, that we wanted to show you exactly how it was done, and how, yeah, the early stages can look kind of scruffy and half-formed, and then the thing gradually, as it were, kind of proves and raises and bakes, you know?
Yeah. Well, I think that's kind of one of the things that people often sort of have, is that there is just that finished page, and you're looking at it in a comic or a graphic novel, and it's like, it seems like it's perfect, but you know, you're not seeing that process, that actually all the kind of blood, sweat and tears that's going into it.
Yeah.
And I think that's important for people to see that.
Yes.
You know, that there is a process of thought. And one of the things I was reading in an interview you did about this book, which I thought was interesting, was you were talking about the system, and you need kind of like a system or a process to follow.
Yeah.
And what we said is the book is not of teaching you how to write, and it's not teaching you how to draw. It's to take those skills that hopefully you've learned elsewhere, and then to put those into a comics system.
Yes. There is kind of a misapprehension about what the art of comics is. The art of comics isn't the art. It isn't really the drawing. It is the synthesis of the words and the pictures to become something else. It's like a good song, that you can't really separate the music and the words. If you think of your favourite songs, there's something that happens when you put the two things together that isn't present in either of the parts. that's why this isn't about how to draw figures or how to do perspective. It kind of touches on it, or it's not a creative writing course. But what it shows you is the way that I do it, and the way that I've discovered over the more than 40 years that I've been doing it, is an efficient way to do comics. One of the problems, though, when you're telling people how to do things is you don't want to be too prescriptive. You don't want to say, this is what you've got to do and that's what you've got to do and then you have to do this. So we do preface it by saying, this is only my way of doing it. But it is worth having a system, because if you're serious about doing comics, you're going to have to do them week after week, to a timetable, to a consistent standard. And you can't just wing it. You can't just hope you'll get lucky. If you know what makes a comic book work, then that's the way you can approach it. And if you follow the system, which kind of in a nutshell is, you always go from the general to the particular. So you always think of the shape of the whole story, then you think of the shape of the pages within the story, then of the panels on the page, then of the elements in the picture, then the details. You never start off just by drawing someone's ear in panel 1 on page 1. You know, I mean, you just can't do that. So I hope it gives people pointers of efficient ways to work and ways that they can get their ideas over it and be creative by all means, but do it in a way that guarantees some sort of consistency and reliability in the results.
Now, I think one of the interesting things is this book wouldn't have been possible if you hadn't been like an insane hoarder. And you know, at any point, I know you've said the great quote, which is, if you keep a diary will keep you.
Yes.
But did you actually honestly think, I will not throw anything away? Because you've got sort of warm-up sketches on bits of paper that you did, and
I know,
and you just stuck it away. I mean, didn't you never think, where am I going to keep all this stuff?
Well, no, but it's strange, because I actually am quite ruthless about selling my actual original artwork. You know, pages of comics I've drawn, I've always sold. I've never... there's a very few that I don't want to part with for particular reasons, and quite often an artist with a piece of work he doesn't want to part with, it isn't because it's particularly well done, but it's the thing that came the closest to the way you saw it in your head, or it reminds you of a particular time of doing comics, or it was a page that you made a kind of a breakthrough on, or you did something that you can't quite understand how you did it, so it seems fresh to you. But yeah, I suppose because the preparatory work only tends to be on typing paper or stuff that will fit in a folder, it's much easier to keep. And I've got filing cabinets in my studio, and there's just a load of files thrown in there. And I already got one book out of all the Watchmen roughs and everything I kept, which was called Watching the Watchmen. And I've got this book out of it as well, and I'm going to be doing I'm actually more or less written my autobiography, and that's going to be published hopefully next year. And I've got all the illustrations I need for that, all the unseen work. I think it is because it is almost like a diary. It is like the diary you're talking about, because you can see, oh, I didn't just draw this page of Green Lantern, I actually did these little scribbles, and then I did this, and then I did that. So it's almost like the kind of passing of time, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it brings back those memories of what you were doing as you were creating that.
Yeah, and sometimes, you know, just to digress a little bit, but no doubt there are people in this room who like to draw and like to write, and probably like me and like most artists and writers, you're slightly dissatisfied with your finished work, because there's a thing that always happens that you think, right, this next job I do, this is going to be the one, this is going to be the best ever. And then you start to do it, and it's kind of work. You've got to figure out how you're going to do it, and then you can't quite do it the way you saw it, and you compromise, or time gets a bit tight and you have to finish it, or you run out of room, and you do it, and by the time you've finished it, you sort of vaguely hate it. And then you send it off, and then you get the printed thing, you think, oh God, and all you can see are the mistakes. And then you fold it up and put it in a drawer, and then a couple of years later you're looking for something else, and you pull that particular comic out and you look at it and you think, oh, it's all right. You don't think, oh, it's brilliant, after you think, oh, it's all right. And the way I've rationalised that, and I think it's true, is that you're the only person in the world who saw what it could have been. All that anybody else sees is what it actually is. And years later, when you've forgotten about it, you're seeing it as it actually is. So be prepared for a bit of discouragement. And, you know, the fact that you keep going when you're discouraged is the most important thing. And any artist, and I've been lucky enough to know probably the best artists in the field, are all the same, that they're all, wish I could have done it better, that didn't quite go right, and they're very hard on themselves. You also shouldn't be so hard on yourself. And you know, I think as long as you feel you've given it the best shot under the circumstances. And again, the thing with comics, if they pay you for it, they're happy enough with it, and that's really the only judgment you need. Money talks, bullshit walks.
So I mean that brings up a really interesting point, is because comics fits in this kind of weird hinterland between what is necessarily kind of fine art and kind of what considered kind of low commercial art. You know, you are producing something that is a work of art, but you have the commercial issues of like a deadline. You can't keep working at it forever. You know, you have to let go of that work at some point.
Yes, yeah. And indeed, you know, I've always felt that the deadline is your friend. One of the things that's difficult when you're trying to do your own comics is that there is no limit to it. You know, you can always put it off to another day. You can always do yeah, well, you know, I'm a bit tired today, I'll do it tomorrow, or I had too much to drink last night, or I really ought to go and get the shopping, you know. Whereas if you've got a deadline, you have to do it, and the deadline forces you to do stuff that you probably wouldn't otherwise do. And to me, some of the most inventive comic art is done by people like Jack Kirby or Steve Ditko, who works at an insane pace, and who actually did it without thinking. And to me, there's an artistic interest in it, because they drew it at a level below analysis. It was just like automatic. You know, it's like if you're talking spontaneously, or you planned a speech, you know, even if when you talk spontaneously it goes a bit haywire, or you wander off, or it's still got an interest to it because it's what you genuinely think rather than the very polite thing you've worked out. So I would encourage you to sort of if you're trying to break into comics, set yourself deadlines, realistic deadlines, and say, okay, by the end of this week, even if I'm only able to do it for a few hours a day, I am going to do a whole page, or I am going to do a whole issue, you know, depending how fast you are, and just get it done, you know, rather than procrastinate. Having said that, after all the years I've been doing it, I still procrastinate, but that kind of self-discipline is something that's really, really important if you want to work consistently.
I don't think I've met a single creative who doesn't leave it to the last bloody minute, and that that deadline does focus the mind.
Of course, and that's actually what you find. You're quite correct. That's what artists do. If they've got loads of time, they leave it until they haven't got any time, because otherwise there's no great incentive. I used to share a studio with an artist called Mick McMahon, who to me is like the definitive dread artist, and he would say he have a 6-page dread to do, and he'd have 3 weeks to do it in, and by the end of 2.5 weeks he would have maybe a couple of drawings on a few of the pages, and then he'd have a day and a half to finish it, and he would just do it. He'd just draw it, and I'd actually help him by filling in the solid blacks, which I take no credit for because it's completely mechanical. And the amusing thing is that whenever you see people analyse his work, or fanzines or whatever, extract bits of it as examples, it's always the pictures I knew that he drew in 20 minutes, and not the pictures that he took 3 days to do. I saw Mick once, he had to draw a judge boot. In one of the Judge Dredd annuals, there's a scene where the undercity dwellers are coming up through the pavement, and the first picture is a judge boot, you know, one of those big gnarly judge boots. The second picture is a judge boot, exactly the same, but with a pickaxe coming through it from under the city. And the third one is exactly the same judge boots with an under-city dweller kind of coming up and looking around. So it's just, the judge boot was the same 3 times. But obviously once you've drawn it once, then the rest is just copy. To draw that first judge boot took me 2 days. 2 days.
Yeah.
And, you know, there are dangers in procrastination. Get it done. Get it done. That's my advice.
Excellent. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask? No? Oh, yeah, down the front.
Yeah,
Chelsea.
Chelsea.
So, you said that most of them that a lot of the artists tend to be a bit of kind of perfectionists and never kind of really happy with any of the work. What point do you get when you kind of look at it and you say, okay, no, I either have to leave it, throw it away, or just finish it, or it's good?
Well, I mean, if you've got a deadline, then that dictates it. But then here's the thing, it comes back to what I said about start from the general and go to the particular. If you draw in the correct order, even if you have to stop it, it will still be a good drawing. If you look at any great artist, no matter where they stop doing the drawing, it's still a good drawing, and it's still a complete drawing. It's just not a finished drawing. And sometimes in comics you have to do that. You have to think, what is essential about this, and only draw what's essential, and then if you've got a bit more time, add a bit more detail, or you know, do something with it. But to me, the first thing I do is thumbnails of the pages, and once I've done those thumbnails, I know that I can draw each panel in 20 minutes if I have to. I would like to spend longer, but I've solved all the problems, and I can show what the panel is about. I can show all the elements in it, rather than getting bogged down on one panel and trying to get their ear just right, and then doing the nose, and then a bit of texture in the background. You know, that's why, as I say in the book, you really do need that system. And it's not just to do comics. I think in most schools where they would teach you to draw, that's what they do. Get the gesture right, the big sweep of the thing. Get the areas, the shapes right. Get the structure right, the three-dimensionality of it right, and then do the finished drawing on that. And as long as you've done the early stages right, it's always going to look like a good drawing.
Yeah, it's
that hard to part with it when you're not completely happy?
Yeah, but then you know, you might as well accept you're never going to be completely happy with it, and nothing's, you know. So just to chase perfection is to waste your time. Nothing is perfect. Nothing's perfect. So you just get it to the point that you're not totally ashamed of it.
Yeah. Matisse kind of went in reverse in the sense that he was starting very much with the particular, and as he got up, you know, later in his career, he was getting down to just getting that simple line and just getting as much information across in the barest possible lines that he could create.
Absolutely. It's an interesting thing as well with naive art. People who don't know anything about drawing, who've never been taught, they tend to go for detail. And one of the things that people will say about work, my mum and dad would say, oh, you put such a lot of detail in. And if you haven't got a trained eye, you haven't done a lot of drawing, you fixate on detail. It's the least important thing. And then as you evolve, you start to appreciate artists. There's an American comic book artist called Alex Toth, who some may be familiar with. He is the artist. You talk to anybody in comics, who's your favourite artist, they will always mention him. And his motto was, refine everything down to its simplest form and then draw the hell out of it. So it was all about getting the gesture, the composition, the drama right. Draw the hell out of what you have to draw, but you don't have to draw anything. And he would quite often have panels that were figures in silhouette, but they do everything that they needed to do. So you will find as you draw more and more that you tend to go towards the general rather than the particular. I hope this isn't being too abstruse. I feel I might be being a bit Radio 3, but anyway.
No, but I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned about Alex Toth. Is that...
Yeah, I thought it was Toth, but it is Toth.
Is it? Yeah. Oh, okay, right. So is that it's the negative space that he uses. It's what he doesn't draw that kind of works rather than what he has drawn, and it's that balance which you talk about in the book, which is something I hadn't really thought about actually before, but that solid balance between the black and the whites and how they're arranged on the page.
And not even what you draw, but where you draw it, or how big you draw it, or how it relates to the other pictures. You know, if you want a close-up, an extreme close-up, that better be the only extreme close-up on the page, because otherwise it's all so you need that variety. And if you want to draw somebody looking lonely or unhappy, you can, you know, go draw all the tears and the little frown lines and the little chewed fingernails and get into all that. Or you can just draw a big expanse with an isolated figure in it with their head bowed, and it will give you the idea, and you don't have to draw all the detail. I don't know if there are any accountants in the room, but many years ago, before I became the world expert on comics, which I clearly am, I was a surveyor, and we had to do sort of economics. That was part of the course. And there's a thing called the law of diminishing returns, which is that for every additional bit of work you do, you get less and less return. So, you know, it's the first 10 minutes you spend on the drawing that's important. That's more important than the 3 hours you spend adding detail. I met Jack Kirby briefly, and he wouldn't have a clue who I was anyway. Never met Steve Ditko, but these were pretty straight-laced, conservative, blue-collar American type people, not people who ingested LSD and lived the artist life, but just through not censoring their imagination, they became incredibly creative. And you look at their work, and it looks like it's from another planet, and that is because you don't have time to think about what you're doing or to become too analytical about it. So it's always walking that line. And the thing that I've found, that if you do the planning properly, which doesn't mean you spend a lot of time or labour on it, just means you do it properly and you consider it as a thing to be done, then quite often the drawing becomes very easy, and it does almost draw itself. I've had a couple of experiences where I've done things without conscious effort. There's a text story I wrote, a Hellblazer story, and I'd never written a text story before, and I sat down at the computer because I had the title for it, and it was Another Bloody Christmas, so I set that up in Adobe Illustrator and did a little scribble of where the art might be, and I thought, oh, I wonder what it's going to look like with some text. And I started typing in Adobe Illustrator, and then I realised that I was actually writing the story. I didn't even know what I was going to write next. I hadn't planned it at all, and I really should have been going shopping. And I thought, oh well, I'll just do a bit more. 2 hours later, I'd written the whole story, and I thought, that's just great.
And no one got a Christmas present that year.
No. And so it was. There was something there about the pressure being. I'd sat down to do something, and I wasn't really intending to do it anyway. But you'll find if you do get into art, I'm sure those of you draw anyway, you have a lot of these internal processes going on, and I'm quite fascinated by them as to the things that enable you to become productive and creative. And it isn't. It has got a lot to do with process, but it's also got a lot to do with, if it becomes ingrained enough, you no longer think about it. I suppose that's what I'm trying to say. Yeah. And you don't get stuck on the superficial things. Your attention goes towards the deeper things.
Subconscious kind of approach. And, you know, it's quite a magical thing, isn't it? You're creating an image out of nothing. Essentially, it's your head and a pen just, producing this stuff.
There is also the thing where you can sort of warm up. That's quite often a good thing to do, not just sit down and start drawing the finished picture. It is quite a good idea just to get your hand moving, and even do simple exercises like just try and draw a circle or try and draw a square. And I used to joke, there's a friend of mine, we were going on a long flight to Malaysia, and he said, oh, it's 13 hours on the plane. He said, I know, you can teach me to draw. And I said, well, I could probably teach you to draw in about 2 hours, but then it would probably take you another 20 years to learn how to see. Because to actually draw is actually quite simple. Anybody who can write their name and divide a line equally can draw. It's like target practice in some ways, but you then have to learn how to see the world around you and have to learn how to convert that into a drawing. And as I was saying, I think, to Chelsea earlier, the trick of it is that you see it in 3 dimensions. You don't see it flat. You see it in 3 dimensions. So by observing the world around you, you learn how to convert the perceived 3-dimensionality of the world around you into a flat thing. And really, that's what drawing is about. And when you're imagining things to draw in a comic, you're imagining the 3-dimensional scene. Even Alex Toth, who was renowned for his flat black abstract patterns, actually saw it very acutely in 3 dimensions. I'm rambling off at a tangent here, but there was a big book of his art out recently, and I looked in absolute wonder at a page, because he used to do these sort of Errol Flynn swashbuckling heroes, and this guy's standing there leaning on the undercarriage of a plane, and in the background is the propeller of the plane. And like, if you were to draw a propeller, you'd draw a circle and draw a couple of blades like you can have it. But he'd drawn it with the blade edge on, and you absolutely saw it in 3 dimensions. It was just like a 2-dimensional thing like that, but he completely understood the dynamic and the shape of that solid object.
And allowing the reader's eye to fill in the gaps.
Yeah, it was a white shape on a black background, but it was the vein of a propeller, perfectly drawn, simply perfectly drawn, because he understood it.
Yeah, excellent.
Oh, we're getting deep on this. But mainly I just get tracing paper and find a good reference. And just I did a Superman annual, and I kept it with Alan Moore, and I kept that because that was really a sort of a fanboy dream come true, because it was Superman, it was written by Alan, it was edited by Julius Schwartz, who edited all my favourite comics. So that to me is a kind of totem of
so have
that.
you got all the original artwork for that one?
No, I've just got the cover. I think I might have I actually thought I had a page that I now discover I don't have, because Joe sold it to him. So, so there's that. There's a cover I did. It's a painted cover for a Dark Horse comic that was my mum's favourite thing that I ever did, because it looks like a proper painting. It's in this book somewhere.
Yeah.
I did a series of covers for the French editions of Watchmen, and I've kept the Rorschach one because he's the most popular character, and it's a good record or something. So, and I've got there's a Comedian Games cover where he's got a gun like this and the smoke, and that just turned out the way that I wanted it to.
That's
but
the only bit of yours that's on the wall.
It is.
Yeah.
It's only because when I got it back, someone had framed it. The games company kept it for several years and then felt guilty and gave it to me back in the frame. Otherwise, it would be in the drawer with all the rest of it. But no, I mean, I've only got probably at the maximum maybe a dozen, 20 for everything I've ever done, and it's thousands of pages. That's all I've actually got. But I have got all the roughs and sketches.
But you've got thousands of the roughs and the sketches and all of that back matter. Yeah, that's incredible.
There's sort of 2 distinct ways of working in comics. There's the full script method, which is where you get a script which is like a screenplay or a stage play, where it will describe what's happening in the picture, and then you'll get the dialogue, all the captions, and it might be broken down into pages, or it might be just run on like a screenplay. Or you'll get a plot where it will tell you as if you're chatting about it. Oh, this happens, and then they do this, and then, and I always prefer working full script, because somebody's got to be in charge of it, and I like to know exactly what the characters are saying and exactly what they're doing. Otherwise, it's like feeling around in the dark. And then if you do it that way, then the writer gets it back and he has to somehow come up with words that fit the spaces you've left. So it's always a weird compromise. So, but whether you're doing it that way or full script, you know how many pages it's got to be. And so what you've essentially got to do is to break it down into the pages to see how many pages it's going to fit. And then you've got to break each page down into panels. And so you've always got a roadmap. The script or the plot is a roadmap. And what I'd quite often do as I was reading the script or the plot is just with a biro or something, just do a little scribble if an idea occurred to me for a composition of a page or a bit of a sequence, and then read the script a couple of times and see what other ideas I could get, and then take those scruffy little drawings and do slightly less scruffy but still small drawings, which are thumbnails. They're called thumbnails because they would fit on your thumb. In the days when paper was very expensive, the Renaissance artists would draw in pen on their thumbs, literally. That's why it's called a thumbnail. And again, they're still not even really proper drawings. They're like a glimpse of something. They're like, if I was trying to draw one of these comic covers, I could get the main shapes of it, but I'm not quite sure. And then refine that, and then end up with a sheet that's got all the pages on it, that if you squinted at it from a distance, it almost looks like the book's already been done. And then it's just a question really of bringing that into focus and to solving the drawing problems and making the anatomy work and the composition and the perspective and all those things. But the crucial breakdown is just that. And also it means you never start with a blank page. You've always got even the roughest little scribble somewhere that you can build on. Because if you put something down, and this applies to writing, you'll hear writers talk about, don't be afraid of a shitty first draft, because if you've got something down, you can edit it, you can change it. If you've got nothing, so always kill the blankness of the page. I would never put a bit of finished artboard on the thing and think, oh, where am I going to start? It would always be expanding and inflating and defining.
Yeah.
I think it's probably harder now because, you know, when I was breaking in, there were lots of sort of little jobs you could be given. I mean, 2000 AD famously would start new writers and artists with their little future shock stories, which were 2 or 3 page sort of shock ending stories. And you could get an idea from that whether somebody could write and whether somebody could draw. So people used to get in like that. Nowadays, you know, people expect to go straight onto X-Men or something like that. There aren't any places to make your mistakes, really. But on the other hand, it's easy to get your stuff seen because there's the huge online thing. It's easier through things like, I don't know, DeviantArt to meet collaborators. It's always been more difficult, I think, to break in as a writer because you can look at a drawing, you can look at a single panel and kind of figure out if someone can draw or not. You have to, you know, as an editor, you know this better, but, you know, you have to plough your way through a script. So that can be an obstacle.
Yeah, no, I would go along with that. I would say, yeah, it's. I think the people that have it probably easiest, in inverted commas, are probably writer artists. If you're illustrating your own stuff, you're not relying on another person to give you a script, and you're drawing your own material, and you know you can present something as a totality, and you can do that as Dave says online. You can self-publish. There are lots of more channels like that. But to then, so that the ways of doing it, I mean, when we started out, it was kind of doing your own little fanzines, wasn't it? And
yeah.
You would staple these things together, and you might sell a couple of hundred if you're lucky, and go around to all the shops and do that, and go to the comic conventions. Now you have that worldwide audience, so you're doing it in a digital way, but you're reaching a much broader audience. So there is that's a big plus, but there are so many more people now doing it because the accessibility is there. You know, there are a lot more people now attempting that perhaps hadn't done in the past, which is great because I think it has really broadened and diversified creators for around the world. We've seen so much different styles and approaches, and there are more publishers now. I mean, there are a lot more publishers of comics. I mean, it used to be from Marvel, DC, 2000 AD, and a few others, but now it has really broadened out. So yeah, I'd say it's a kind of double-edged sword, really.
And, and also years ago you were never going to get rich working in comics. You were going to get a page rate, no reprint money, no royalty money. It was like being a bricklayer. And but things are much better than that now, and you can get really, really lucky and have a Hollywood blockbuster, and you know, make a lot of money. So it tends to attract people into the field who maybe would have not worked in the field before, would have worked in commercial art, who are maybe better trained, who will take longer to make the pages look right, would be able, even people hire models to pose, or you know, build 3D models of things. So yeah, there's probably more competition, but talent will show through. And also, as Tim and I were saying earlier, there is talent and there is genius, but there is also persistence, and often persistence will pay off, and some of the most talented people haven't got the persistence. But if you keep going, and if you can get feedback from writers and artists and pay attention to it and take it on board and not argue with it, as sometimes happens, you know, somebody wants you to look at their work and you tell them in a kind way what's wrong with it, and they'll give you an argument that there isn't anything wrong with it. And anyway, you know, you don't draw feet properly anyway, you know. So, but what you will find in the comic book fraternity, and not just when they're writing a book that they're selling for money, but you will find that people in the world of comics are very helpful to up and coming people and to each other, because we've all been there. And you know, I'm sitting up here, but I'd have been sat there with you guys. So there are house styles. I mean, you look at Marvel comics, DC comics, there is a house style, but particularly online comics and a lot of self-published comics, there's a huge diversity that have got got an audience. So it's not necessarily you have to draw in an academically perfect way.
I would even go so far as to say that actually sort of the big two have started to embrace that now. And
Yeah.
when you see there isn't so much of a house style anymore, they will do sort of like a Humberto Ramos slightly cartoony kind of style alongside a slightly more realistic David Finch style, you know, sort of.
Yeah.
So there is that diversity is there, and I think that's all for the good actually of the industry. That it's sort of not all, you know, just draw like Jim Lee, you know, or just draw like Rob Liefeld kind of thing. It's much more diverse than that, and I think that's a strength that the industry has probably benefited from as a whole, because although it might not be everyone's taste, you will find an audience for your art style, and that art style is unique to you. Even though you might, you know, maybe sort of been influenced by several different artists, what you're doing is still going to be your own unique perspective on that. And you will find that audience, and the key is to nurture that audience. So.
I think it's almost like mainstream book publishing. You know, there are the kind of genre books, and there's literature. You know, and that kind of is happening in comics and graphic novels nowadays, I think.
Yeah, I think the one area, I was chatting with someone earlier about this, that I think is going to be quite interesting, that hasn't been done so much in the Western world. They've been doing a lot in Japan, is doing non-fiction. I mean, there is stuff coming out there. Daryl Cunningham did a interesting thing all about the crash, super crash, and he did a thing about false science tales. But looking at non-fiction through a comics filter and using that. So things like, you know, what Joe Sacco's been doing, you know, looking at reportage, and that side, I think I'd like to see a bit more development on. The difficult thing is, of course, it's much quicker and cheaper and easier to do that using other medium than it is with comics. And you have to find out what comics do best in order to fit those kind of genres, as it were. So I think, you know, there are strengths of comics, but there are also weaknesses in those areas.
Yeah, I got involved with the Oxford University Press, who were trying to put comics into schools, what they call graphic text, and they had several different strands. There was original fiction, there was adapted fiction, which was like classics illustrated, you know, out of copyright stuff like, you know, Jack London and that kind of stuff. Yeah, and then they did series of great inventors, great explorers, and they worked very well, just the kind of non-fiction stuff that you're talking about, to get a quite a complex story over in a very easily digestible way. And the other thing they did that was a huge surprise to me was poetry, and I would have thought poetry was a really odd thing to do in comics because it's so subjective. But what I hadn't counted on was how they actually teach reading in schools, which is they use the text as a basis for discussion, and in the poetry they were able to say, look, okay, it's one of the World War I poets, he's drawn this woman looking out at sea, why has he done that? And what would you have done to show that? So it's using comics in a way to get people's minds working. So yeah, I mean, and again, I think, you know, us people in comics have always felt that there isn't anything that you can do in mainstream text publishing that you can't do in comics, and you can do a lot more in comics. So I think, again, with all these things we're talking about, it's comics kind of coming up to the level of mainstream publishing. And also my experience, just to finish, when I was a comics laureate and talked to school librarians and teachers, was in schools, they're much more open to comics nowadays in all areas of education. So that's a very encouraging thing as well. The experience was we thought we were going to have to persuade people to get comics, and it's no, we use them all the time anyway. So that's something that sort of snuck up on us, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
So do you have any comics recommendations that we should be picking?
Oh, I wish you hadn't asked me that, because you always miss something out, you know. You mean what, current work or in general?
Current stuff that's top of Marvel, DC, everybody.
Well, you know, to be honest with you, I don't look at a lot of that stuff anymore. I'm tending to, because, you know, talked about Alex Toth, for instance. He's somebody whose work I've always loved. Even when I was a kid, I knew there was something special about it. And there's all sorts of editions of, say, his work coming out, and that's what I gravitate towards. You know, there's so much contemporaneous material out. You can never look at it all anyway, and I could snatch odd issues I've seen. But I think there's something to be said for like doing the archaeology on it, because I sort of grew up reading DC comics and I sort of liked their house style and I kind of emulated it. And then you find out who those artists were looking at, and they were looking at the newspaper cartoonists. And then you find out who they were looking at, and they were looking at the magazine illustrators. So that's one of the things that fascinates me in comics now, is to see how we got where we are now, which is a finite thing to study rather than the explosion of stuff that comes out every month.
Personally, I tend to follow creators I like rather than necessarily titles. So it's who's doing what. I mean, I really like Brian K. Vaughan's stuff. I think he does some really nice writing. I just recently read all of Kieran Gillen's Uber, which is about superhero Nazis, which was which is quite interesting. Not great artwork, but really interesting stories. And he's done a sort of very thorough look. If you like anything Garth Ennis has done, it kind of fits in alongside that sort of really. So if you like his war comics,
I mean, I'm reminded of a couple of things that I have enjoyed recently, and one was Hawkeye, and it was drawn by David Aja. Is that how you say?
Oh yeah.
Which is just wonderful comic book storytelling. And the thing that I loved a series that DC put out called The Sheriff of Babylon, and now those guys, Tom King and Mitch Gerads, are doing Mr. Miracle, and it's just amazing. You know, it's
a lot of good things about that.
It's just incredible, but it's a real good exercise in comic book storytelling. I think that's what I like about it, and it's a really fresh treatment of those sort of somewhat now archetypal Kirby kind of characters. So there will be an odd thing that will register, but it tends to register with me because it's a novel way of doing comics, not the particular art quality or the particular writing quality.
It's pushing the medium, doing something different with it.
Seeing a different way of telling stories. My stepdaughter is now a teacher, and she was training to be a teacher. She, as part of her training, she had to teach kids with learning difficulties, and they got onto the subject of films and then games and then comics. And one kid who'd been very unreceptive to anything put his hand up and said, "I love manga." And she said, oh dear, yeah, I've heard of manga. And she said, oh, my stepfather's, he draws comics, and he was sort of not really that interested in it. But at the end of the week, he brought his bag in with him. He said, "Please, miss, I've brought my favourite thing in to show you." And he pulled it out, and it was Frank Miller's 300 graphic novel. So it's a comic. So there's this kid who doesn't read easily, hard to interest in things, now knows about the Battle of Thermopylae because he's seen it in a graphic novel, in a very stylised graphic novel, but he's engaged with that, and it's become something that's a big favourite of his. So, yeah, and I think it's an increasingly visual world as well, and children are given a lot of visual stimulus, and I think they do see comics, and they see them in maybe a more open-minded way, whereas when I was growing up, and maybe so for Tim, it was a guilty pleasure, something that you had to keep to yourself. Now I think it's sort of celebrated by children and teachers and everything. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Cheers, Tim. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for coming.
Oh, that's working because that was bouncing up and down.
Okay.
We're done. You can all go home now. Draw comics.